Oscar Piastri just shocked the entire paddock in Melbourne. Fastest lap of the first day. At his home Grand Prix, McLaren suddenly on top of the timing screens. But while everyone was celebrating that lap, Max Verstappen was already studying something much more important. Because hidden inside that fastest lap, there was a detail that could expose the real balance of power for the entire 2026 season. A detail that almost nobody noticed. Not the commentators. Not most fans. But Verstappen did. And what he saw might explain why Red Bull's new RB22 looked fast in flashes, yet strangely vulnerable during the first practice sessions in Australia. A car that stopped in the pit lane. A car that later bounced through the gravel and lost pieces of its floor. A car that still finished only a few tenths away from the top. Which raises a much bigger question. Did Piastri actually reveal McLaren's advantage today? Or did that lap accidentally expose something much bigger about Red Bull's new engine project with Ford? Because the truth behind that fastest lap may completely change how we understand this entire weekend. And once you see the detail Verstappen noticed, you cannot unsee it. So before we break down exactly what happened in Melbourne today, and why that lap might be hiding a much bigger story, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because this Australian Grand Prix weekend has already started with a mystery. And we are only on day one. To understand what really happened in Melbourne today, we need to start with the atmosphere before the cars even touched the track. Because this Australian Grand Prix is not just another season opener. It is the beginning of an entirely new technical era. New power units. New electrical systems. New aerodynamic compromises. And for the first time in its history, Red Bull arrived with something completely different under the engine cover. Their own power unit project. Built together with Ford. For years Red Bull dominated Formula One using the Honda architecture. An engine that proved powerful, reliable, and extremely well integrated with the car. That combination helped produce one of the most dominant periods the sport has ever seen. But 2026 resets everything. And suddenly Red Bull is not the team defending a perfected formula anymore. They are the team running a brand new experiment. A bold one. A risky one. Because designing your own engine in modern Formula One is one of the most complex engineering challenges in motorsport. Thousands of components. Extreme electrical systems. Battery management. Energy deployment. Thermal stability. Every small mistake can cost tenths of a second. Or worse, reliability. That is why the RB22 is such an important car. Not just for this season, but for the entire future of the Red Bull project. The chassis itself is incredibly compact, even by Red Bull standards. The side pods are aggressively sculpted. The airflow management around the front suspension is extremely detailed. And the floor of the car, as always with Adrian Newey-inspired philosophy, is designed to generate as much clean aerodynamic load as possible. But the real challenge is hidden inside the car. The integration between chassis and power unit. Because the new hybrid systems in 2026 play a much larger role than before. Electrical deployment is no longer a secondary factor. It is central to performance. Teams must decide exactly when to release energy, where to recover it, how to balance battery usage across an entire lap, and how to prevent overheating. If you get that balance right, the car accelerates harder out of corners. It reaches higher top speeds. And it maintains performance over longer runs. If you get it wrong, the car looks fast in certain moments, but inconsistent over a full lap. And that possibility is exactly why some engineers in the paddock were watching Red Bull very closely today. Because even before the Australian Grand Prix began, there were quiet rumors inside the paddock. Rumors about the electrical side of the Red Bull Ford power unit. Some insiders suggested Mercedes might still have an advantage in energy deployment. Others believed Ferrari had achieved extremely stable battery performance. Which means Red Bull might be compensating through aerodynamics instead. Trying to build the most efficient car on the grid to offset any electrical deficit. Now here is where things start connecting to what we saw on track today. Because when the first practice session began in Melbourne, Red Bull did not look slow. But they did not look dominant either. Ferrari immediately looked comfortable. Leclerc topped the timing sheets. Hamilton followed closely behind. And Verstappen slotted into third. A solid position. But something about the lap did not look effortless. The RB22 seemed slightly nervous through certain corners. Not unstable. But not completely planted either. And Verstappen himself had already warned that the car might not yet be the fastest. Which makes his third place in the session even more interesting. Because sometimes in Formula One, the most important message is not the lap time. It is the tone of the driver. And Verstappen sounded unusually realistic about Red Bull's chances this weekend. Almost cautious. Which is something we rarely hear from him. But that calm atmosphere did not last long, because the second practice session was about to reveal the first real crack in Red Bull's weekend. And it happened in the most unexpected place possible: the pit lane. The second practice session began normally. Cars leaving the garage, teams starting their programs, drivers warming up their tires for the first flying laps. And then, only a few minutes into the session, something strange happened. Max Verstappen rolled down the pit lane. Everything looked normal. Until it didn't. Just before reaching the pit lane exit, the RB22 suddenly stopped. Completely stopped. No spin. No contact. No dramatic failure. The car simply shut down beneath him. For a few seconds there was confusion. Then the radio messages started. Mechanics rushed out of the garage. Marshals moved toward the car. And the reigning world champion found himself sitting motionless in the pit lane of the very first race weekend of the season. The RB22 had to be pushed back to the garage. A scene that felt very unfamiliar for Red Bull. For years their cars rarely showed that kind of operational problem. Everything about the team usually looked precise, efficient, almost surgical. But today, in Melbourne, things suddenly looked very different. More than 20 minutes passed while the team worked inside the garage. 20 minutes that every other team on the grid was using to collect data. Running fuel programs. Testing tire degradation. Understanding track evolution. All the information that engineers desperately need on a Friday. Meanwhile Verstappen could only wait, watching the clock, watching the other cars circulate. And this matters more than many fans realize. Because practice sessions are not about chasing lap times. They are about building knowledge. Every lap gives engineers information about balance, tire wear, energy deployment, cooling, and braking stability. Lose 20 minutes of that process, and the entire weekend becomes harder. Especially when you are running a completely new car. Eventually the RB22 returned to the track. But the session had already slipped away. The team was now rushing through its program. Trying to recover lost data. Trying to understand how the car behaved over longer runs. And this is when the next moment arrived. The one that many people watching probably thought was just a small mistake. But it revealed something much more important. Verstappen attacked the fast section of the circuit. The RB22 looked quick on entry. Stable through the middle of the corner. Then suddenly the rear stepped out. A sharp snap of oversteer. The kind that arrives without warning. In a fraction of a second the car slid toward the grass. Then bounced violently across the gravel. The floor hitting the ground again and again. And pieces of the underbody flying into the air. The moment looked dramatic on camera. But the real damage was invisible. Because the floor of a Formula One car is the most sensitive aerodynamic component on the entire machine. It generates the majority of the downforce. Tiny changes in its shape can destroy the airflow underneath the car. And once that airflow is disturbed, performance disappears. From that point forward Verstappen was no longer driving a perfectly healthy RB22. He was driving a compromised one. Yet even with the lost time, even with a damaged floor, even with a disrupted session, he still finished the practice session 6th fastest. Less than a second away from the top. And the driver sitting at the top of the timing screens was Oscar Piastri. Fastest lap of the day. The home crowd erupting with excitement. McLaren suddenly looking like a serious threat at the very first race of the season. But while the crowd celebrated, Verstappen and the Red Bull engineers were already studying something very different. Not the lap time itself, but how that lap was achieved. Because when you break down a Formula One lap in detail, sometimes the fastest time reveals more about your rivals than about yourself. And the data hidden inside Piastri's lap was about to raise a very uncomfortable question for Red Bull. A question that could define the entire weekend in Australia. Now here is the detail that caught Verstappen's attention. Because when engineers analyze a lap, they do not look only at the final time. They break the lap into tiny pieces. Corner by corner. Acceleration zone by acceleration zone. And what they saw in Piastri's fastest lap was interesting. Very interesting. The McLaren was extremely strong in a few specific sections of the track. Particularly on corner exits. Places where the car suddenly gained speed much faster than the others. Not everywhere. Not across the entire lap. Only in certain zones. And in modern Formula One, that pattern usually points to one thing. Energy deployment. The way the hybrid system releases electrical power along the lap. This is one of the biggest strategic puzzles of the new 2026 regulations. Every team must decide exactly how their battery power is used. Too aggressive early in the lap, and the system runs out of energy before the end of the straight. Too conservative, and you lose acceleration where it matters most. It is a constant balancing act. And when Verstappen's engineers compared sector data, they noticed that Piastri's lap seemed to deploy energy very aggressively in key acceleration points. The car launched out of slow corners with remarkable force, almost like a small burst of extra power, which immediately raises an important question. Is McLaren already comfortable pushing their electrical deployment this hard? Or is Red Bull still being careful with their system? Because the RB22 is still learning how to use its new power unit. This is the first season of the Red Bull Ford project. New battery, new hybrid architecture, new control software. And early in a season like this, teams often run conservative energy maps while they gather data, which means the car may not yet be showing its real performance. That possibility is exactly what Verstappen seemed to suggest earlier this week. He never said the car lacked speed. He said the team was still discovering where the real limits were. And Friday in Melbourne looked exactly like that kind of learning process. A car that can be quick, but only in short bursts. A car that sometimes looks brilliant, and sometimes unpredictable. And that unpredictability might explain what happened later in the session. Because the snap of oversteer that sent Verstappen into the gravel did not look like a simple driver error. It looked like a car still searching for its balance. Still trying to find the exact window where the aerodynamics, suspension, and power delivery work perfectly together. Meanwhile, McLaren looked far more settled. Piastri's lap was smooth, controlled, confident. The kind of lap that suggests the driver trusts the car completely. And when a driver has that level of confidence, lap times usually follow. But there is another layer to this story. A deeper one. Because sometimes the fastest lap in practice is not about showing strength. Sometimes it reveals how early a team is pushing their performance limits. And this is where Verstappen's experience becomes critical. He knows that the first day of a race weekend is often misleading. Some teams chase headlines. Others hide performance. Some push engine modes early. Others wait until qualifying. Which means Piastri's fastest lap might not be the full story. It might simply be the first signal in a much larger battle that is still unfolding beneath the surface. Because if Red Bull truly has more performance hidden inside the RB22, then everything we saw today could look very different by the time qualifying arrives. But there is still one more piece of this puzzle. One detail about the RB22 that could completely change the way we interpret this entire Friday. And that detail has nothing to do with lap times. It has to do with something much more dangerous for Red Bull. The learning curve of their new engine.